After years of research, countless failed relationships because of it, impeccable stress I've acquired due to constant browsing and reading through ancient Baltic scripts in the most remote regions of Karosta, I have finally found the truth about BoJack Horseman. Despite what the liberal socialist California-based media tech giants like Vox, CNN, Fox News, and Alex Jones want you to believe, BoJack Horseman is not actually a horse, but a Latvian. Welcome to Latvia, an itty-bitty country located in the depths of Eastern Europe, known as the Baltic, and definitely unknown to the average American. It is sandwiched between its neighborly states, with Estonia sitting on top of it and Lithuania on the bottom. While in the south it also borders Belarus, and in the east it's favored of all countries in the whole wide world, with whom it has the best of relations and no drama at all: Russia. The country is home to roughly 1.9 million people, the largest number of which identify as ethnic Latvians at 63%, followed by Russians at about 25%, and a bunch of other minorities that make up the rest and no one really cares about. Its capital and largest city is Riga, where the vast majority of its population lives, with roughly 605,000 inhabitants. The second largest is Daugavpils, with 78,000, followed by Liepāja with 67,000, which overall outside of Riga makes the country extremely rural. But enough about lame geography, let's talk about the country's history. The history of Latvia, much like practically any godforsaken country on this earth, begins when humans got the ability to walk and made their way to the region, settling it in around 12,000 BC. But as the majority of it consisted of banging rocks against one another and hunting big hairy elephants, we'll skip ahead. The real history begins some 5,000 years ago when some guys known as the Finno-Ugrics decided to leave their godforsaken frozen tundra in the Ural Mountains and head westward, settling the slightly less godforsaken frozen tundra. Over thousands of years, different Finno-Ugric and what are now known as Baltic peoples start to settle modern-day Latvian lands and do whatever it was that people did in that time, which mainly consisted of trying to survive the winter and not get wiped out by other neighboring Slavic and Nordic tribes. And no, Estonians, I'm not talking about you. Throughout the medieval period, modern-day Latvia became a trading hub, trading as far as the Byzantine Empire and Greece, with their main product being amber, essentially fossilized tree sap that looks pretty on jewelry. As such, the early medieval period was relatively peaceful for the Proto-Latvians, who just lived their lives to the fullest, growing crops, chilling in the woods, eating suspicious mushrooms, and trading pretty rocks they found near water. However, in the 10th century, things slowly started to change as a local tribe chieftains started exerting more power, increasing tribal cohesion and unifying them into what were essentially 4 proto-states, the largest of which were the Latgalians, who were kind of chill and kind of ruled by the Kievan Rus. Then you had the Curonians, who were the second largest and who decided that land is overrated and headed to the sea, inspired by Johnny Depp's impeccable performance in the Pirates of the Caribbean films, to try out the pirate life for themselves, raiding other tribes and kingdoms on the Baltic coast. In the 12th century, trade grew so hard, Europeans actually started to care about the Baltic. Every European's favorite peoples, the Germans, started sending them more and more traders alongside missionaries in an attempt to convert the pagan Balts. The Latvians, known as the Livonians at the time, rejected the teachings of Christ and decided to stick with dancing in the forest and worshipping trees, or whatever the hell it was that pagans did. This apathy over some guy in the desert being nailed to the cross got the Pope extremely mad, hence he decided to call for a crusade against the Baltic peoples in 1195, which would come to be known as the Livonian Crusade. At the same time, the neighboring Scandinavian Vikings decided to go on a world tour and interact with all sorts of different cultures. In their great adventures, they met the Arabs, who for some reason had this whole thing about young boys and girls with blonde hair and blue eyes, sort of similar to another guy. So in an effort to supply their fetish and earn ridiculous amounts of money, the Vikings started to raid Latvia hard and capture their peoples to then sell them off to the Arabs as essentially sex slaves. The Germans as well, for some reason, had a stick up their ass over the Livonians and invaded en masse, burning down thousands of towns and wiping out numerous tribes off the face of the earth. The Livonians, although putting up a good fight, in a couple of decades were defeated as wave after wave of crusaders and Vikings slaughtered their people and devastated their lands. Ultimately, the Germans took control over the region and established the Livonian Order, which would go on to conquer the majority of the Baltics and continuously spurg out if someone dared not to follow the word of Jesus Christ. Fun fact, they did this a lot.
Oh no, oh god, no, that's my book! What?
During this time, they also formed the Hanseatic League, basically a trading and defensive network of merchant guilds and important trade cities. Riga, being founded not too long ago and rising as the new hot trading hub, joined the league in the late 13th century, which raised its importance even more. Within the order, the Germans retained power as a minority, but the local Latvian people enjoyed having rights as long as they paid their taxes on time to the church and kept their praises forwarded to Jesus and not trees. As years went by, trade intensified, and with it, the German nobility acquired even more power. Taxes reached incredibly high amounts, and peasants became ever more dissatisfied and started leaving their estates by moving to Riga or abroad in an effort to escape these unfavorable living conditions. To combat this, the Germans then passed a law which forbade the peasantry to leave their lands, practically making them slaves. In the 16th century, more German shenanigans reached the Latvians as the press and Reformation hit the country. The eager Latvians embraced the hot new teachings of Martin Luther and started burning down Catholic churches and establishing their own in their native tongue. Later the same century, the mess that is the Livonian War broke out, and Latvia became practically fully incorporated into Lithuania as a vassal, while Riga became a city-state. For the next 80 years or so, Latvian lands were ruled under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, until the 17th century when the Swedes decided to invade and conquer large chunks of Baltic and Latvian territory. Under the Bjork Empire, Latvia became an incredibly important part within their realm, serving as essentially its breadbasket, while Riga became the second most populated city after Stockholm. To show their appreciation, the meatball eaters abolished serfdom in estates owned by the crown, limited the land the nobility possessed, and offered jobs in the education, military, and administrative sector to the Latvians. Hell, they even opened up a university and funded the translation of the Bible into Latvian, for which to this day the Latvians still hold their rule in high regard. But much like every relationship I had, this too had to come to an end.
Know your fucking place, trash.
In the beginning of the 18th century, Russia invaded Sweden in an effort to expand its domain. As such, they successfully annexed a large chunk of the Baltic, and almost immediately after reversed the tolerant policies the Swedish cocks established and gave once more special privileges to the German nobility because f*** it, why not? Over the centuries, the Commonwealth would be partitioned 3 times, and by the dawn of the 19th century, all of the Baltic was in Russian hands. The following 19th century in Latvia was mostly marked by reforms. The Russian government, although stepping initially backwards with the rule of Latvia, returned to the way of progress by pushing for laws that would give the peasantry more rights and curb the extent of serfdom. After a law passed that allowed peasants the freedom of movement, many Latvians started moving to cities which were previously mainly inhabited by Germans and Jews, who were mostly the upper class in the region. However, the most notable thing that took place in this time period was the Latvian national awakening. And no, I don't mean that they all just woke up one morning all at the same time. As nationalism started to take over the hearts and minds of Latvians, many famous Latvian books, poems, and other literary works found their beginnings here, and there was an even tiny revival of paganism and Latvian folklore. With the awakening of national and ethnic identity, ethnic tensions also started to rise as the Latvian majority became angry at the German minority for oppressing and ruling over them for centuries. But before they could forward their anger at the Germans, Russia started programs of Russification, limiting the use of both the German and Latvian language in public spaces. As a result, the nationalistic rage became aimed at the Ruskies instead. Tensions finally came to a boil in 1905 when demonstrators took to the streets of Riga, demanding liberation from the Tsar and German nobles. The army was called in to take control of the city and opened fire at the protesters. This did not stop the revolutionaries. Instead, they just moved to operating in rural areas and started targeting German nobles via violent attacks. The government took strict measures to subdue the revolution, and over the next 2 years, its momentum fell. When World War I came around, the Germans invaded Russia and made great advancements in the Baltic. In an effort to keep the Germans at bay, the Russians utilized a scorched earth policy and destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres of Latvian farmland just so it wouldn't fall in the hands of the Kaiser. As a result, a large chunk of Latvia's population was forced to flee and seek refuge until the conflict subsided. The remaining Latvians supported the Russians and joined the fight on their side against the Germans. After the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in Russia, the majority of the Latvians then joined their ranks in the fight for the proletariat. However, at the same time, talks of an independent Latvia also started to be heard. And so, in 1918, after the German war effort in the East collapsed, Latvia decided to declare independence and established a new socialist government. However, the new Soviet government in Russia opposed this and seeked to reclaim all of the territory it had lost previously. So, the Latvian War of Independence began. The war was relatively quick, ending only a year later, and with its end, the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic was established. However, the fighting continued as German Latvians and their sympathizers put up resistance and continued the fight against the Soviets with the direct help of Germany, which then also prompted Poland to get involved, with whom both the Germans and Russians were kicked out, leading to peace being achieved in 1920, Latvia becoming a fully independent state, and Soviet Russia relinquishing authority over its claims in Latvia. Following its independence, Latvia, much like any country that had just gone through a civil war, mostly focused on rebuilding damaged buildings, infrastructure, and nation building. In an effort to distance itself from economic reliance on Russia, Latvia focused on exporting its goods overseas. However, when the Great Depression hit and the entire world collectively was launched into poverty, few were willing to buy these exports, which threw Latvia down the path of political instability. Radical ideologies went on the rise in the country, which prompted the at the time Prime Minister Kaarlis Ulmanis to launch a coup and seize the government for himself in 1934, which would mark the beginning of Latvia's dictatorship. Under him, extremists on both ends of the political spectrum were oppressed and detained, and in general, social liberties were curtailed. Ulmanis' rule didn't last for long, as in the same time period, the Soviets and Germans divided Eastern Europe amongst themselves in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Under pressure from both sides, Latvia, much like the rest of the Baltic states, was forced to host Soviet troops and was later on given an ultimatum by Stalin to join the Union peacefully or to be dragged in by force. The government had no other choice but to accept the Soviets' demands, and thus the fledgling nation was annexed. But as you should know this story by now, the Germans went back on their deal and didn't think much more of the pact than as fancy toilet paper, and in 1941 invaded the Soviet Union. Quickly the Nazis were able to occupy the Baltic, where the local population greeted them as liberators from the Russians, who in their eyes illegally annexed them. However, the enthusiasm over German occupation quickly started to subside as mass killings started to take place and the local Jews and Gypsies start to get rounded up and deported to concentration camps. And although many Latvians volunteered to help the Germans against the Soviets, many more resisted the Nazis and organized partisan resistance movements to fight against the Germans. After the Germans had their teeth kicked in for the second time in the same century, the Soviets returned to the Baltic and yet again occupied and annexed Latvia and her friends. Unlike the previous Soviet occupation, this one was much more brutal. Programs of Russification started yet again, with the Latvian language and culture being demoted to second class, and hundreds of thousands of Latvians would be deported to brutal labor camps known as gulags in Siberia, where the majority would never return. At the same time, Russian immigrants were encouraged to settle within Latvia and were given better paying and cushier jobs than the Latvians themselves. The impact of the Soviet Russification program in Latvia was so brutal that in 1989, ethnic Latvians comprised only 52% of the population, while before World War II, they made up 77%. As such, it was no surprise that Soviet and by default Russian rule became extremely unpopular within the country, and discontent only continued to rise. As the Soviet Union started to liberalize with the Perestroika and Glasnost movement, bells of independence started to ring in Latvia once more. In an effort to make their voices heard, the people of Latvia, in collaboration with their Baltic neighbors, joined hands in a human chain that stretched from Tallinn, Estonia, all the way to Vilnius, Lithuania, Lithuania in 1989. 2 years later, the country was finally free, having declared its independence on September 6, 1991. After its independence, Latvia got busy trying its best to push reforms and integrating within the West. And what would you know, its effort paid off as the country was able to join both the EU and NATO in 2004. Since then, the country has seen great economic growth, and although it is technically the poorest of the Baltic states, its GDP per capita today is nearly double that of its previous occupier. And although more work needs to be done, Latvia has become a prosperous European country. But there's so much you can know about a place from its history. To really get to know Latvia, what better way is there than to go and check it out for ourselves? Okay, but before that, if you're watching this video, you're most likely a curious little traveler like me. And if you travel a lot, you definitely know the struggles of acquiring internet in a foreign country. Hell, when I was in India, I literally got scammed by a tuk-tuk driver because I didn't have an internet connection. The driver drove me to his friend who impersonated an officer and told me the area where my hotel was in was closed due to protests. And the only way to get in was to get a permit from a tourist office, which was in some shady alleyway. Due to being awake for 32 plus hours and not having a SIM card with internet, I was unable to fact check my scammer and ended up losing 300 euros. True story, by the way. And that's why today I've partnered with Saily, so you never have to end up like me. Saily is a new eSIM service app brought to you by Nord Security, the grandfather of everyone's beloved NordVPN. With Saily, you can choose from several affordable eSIM plans in over 180 countries and 8 regions. So no matter where you are in the world, you'll always be connected to the internet with just a simple click of a button. All you gotta do is download the app, pick a plan, and then just simply install the eSIM, and voila, you're connected. Saily is great for any sort of traveler, but it's perfect for those that travel frequently, as Saily offers global and regional plans. What's even better than that is that with code, ironically, you can get 15% off. So don't waste any time, go and click my link in the description and secure yourself some internet for your next trip. When one comes to Latvia, 99% of the people, including myself, mainly visit its capital, Riga. And although I would have loved to see more of the rest of the country, there is so much free time and money you can have. But even so, this city is an outstanding window into the country's history and character. Unlike most European cities that were founded all the way back in Bazillion BC and like to wave their dick around how they are the true descendants of Romans, Riga is much more humble, being founded only in the beginning of the 13th century. Immediately after its foundation, the town became a regional trade juggernaut, peddling goods from all over the world and essentially acting as the medieval version of Amazon headquarters. This prompted the city to become a member of the Hanseatic League, further increasing its economic influence and power, which when you walk through the city's streets, it's hard not to notice. For a large chunk of its history, it was mainly inhabited by the upper class nobility and tradesmen, which were largely made up by Germans and Jews. However, as I mentioned before in the history segment, this slowly started to change throughout the 17th and 19th centuries as the indigenous Latvian peasantry started to make their way into the city to escape the grueling living conditions imposed on them by the nobility. As such, Riga only continued to grow economically and develop further. When the Industrial Revolution finally made its way to the city, its prosperity was put into overdrive. And in this time period, Riga started to take a more familiar shape that we know today. With the influx of manpower and the abundance of mass-produced goods, hundreds of new buildings started to pop up all over town. Most notably, these buildings were built in the Jugendstil style, which is essentially the German off-brand Art Nouveau, for which the city would become famous for. The beauty of these buildings was so iconic that Riga acted as a trailblazer for neighboring cities in the Baltic, across its sea, and a large portion of Western Russia, inspiring many to try and emulate the style the city became famous for. After the country obtained its independence, many museums and galleries started to pop up throughout Riga in an attempt to revitalize local Latvian culture. However, this effort was short-lived, as almost immediately after World War II, the city was taken over by the USSR yet again and made a part of the Soviet Baltic military district. Furthermore, tens of thousands of Latvians were deported and the city became filled with Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusian migrants, whilst the local culture and language were heavily suppressed. Today, however, Riga is back on the commercial and cultural track, with international trade becoming a staple of the city via the Baltic Sea and the establishment of new and modern manufacturing centers. To start off our journey, we'll head first into Riga's Old Town. Located in the heart of the city, Riga's Old Town is where it all began. From its humble beginnings in the 13th century, the Old Town has been an epicenter of transformation. Walking through it, you can find a plethora of medieval stone buildings that have stood the test of time. However, they are not the only ones. Exploring its streets, you can find Romanesque, Gothic, Baroque, and of course Jugendstil buildings as well, each of which has been built at a different time period, which in a way makes walking through Riga's center a trip through time where the history of architecture and artistic movements can be observed and appreciated. In the heart of the Old Town, you can find the city's crown jewel, St. Peter's Church. Originally, much like many grand churches in Europe, St. Peter's Church lies on the grounds of a much smaller church that was built in the early 13th century. However, the first iteration of the church we see today was constructed by the end of the 15th century in the Gothic style. But not that long after, in the mid-17th century, it collapsed in on itself and had to be rebuilt. The second time around, the church was built in the Baroque style and expanded, which made it the highest wooden construction in the world at that time. However, as the church seemed to be cursed, lightning struck the tower and it burned down. Tsar Peter I, aka Peter the Great, seeing this as a great shame, personally decreed for the church to be rebuilt, which it was and remained intact for several centuries onwards until World War II, when artillery destroyed the church. Under the Soviets in 1967, restoration of the church was yet again decreed and completed, giving us St. Peter's last and final form we can see today, until God gets angry with it once more, and it collapses in a new way again. In total, it is 123 meters tall, and on top of its tower you can find a rooster wind vane instead of a cross, because this is a Lutheran church after all. Funny enough, over its history, 7 roosters sat on top of the tower, each meeting a horrible fate by either being blown away by the wind, damaged by a storm, collapsing alongside with the roof, and of course getting hit with artillery. Right next to St. Peter's Church, you can also find St. John's Church. Much like the previously mentioned church, St. John's was also originally built much earlier, sometime around the end of the 13th century. However, a form we can recognize today took shape in the early 16th century. In the early days of its existence, it belonged to the Dominican order, but in 1582, it was taken over by the Latvian Lutheran congregation. After its acquisition, renovations took place to enlarge the church, after which it got the final shape we see today, plus its tower, which came about in the mid-1800s. According to local legend, when St. John's was being reconstructed in the 15th century, 2 monks wished to be canonized, so they were immured into one of the church's walls. As they stood in the walls, Riga's residents would come and check up on them and feed them via a glory hole left for them. Yet, after all was left and done, and the church was built, they were not consecrated, effectively dying in the walls for nothing. But to make them feel a bit better in the afterlife, a cross-shaped hole was made in the outer wall of the church in their honor as a sort of consolation prize. Moving on, we head slightly out of the Old Town to check out one of Riga's most important monuments, the Freedom Monument. Built in 1935, the Freedom Monument, as its name suggests, was erected to celebrate Latvia's newly born independence. On top of the monument, you can see a woman who is holding 3 stars above her, who symbolize the 3 historical regions of the country, Kurzeme, Vidzeme, and Latgale. On the bottom of the monument, more statues of people surrounded, which depict various parts of Latvia's history, such as the Baltic Crusades, Revival period, and World Wars. However, this wasn't always the case. After the Soviet Union repossessed Latvia, Stalin and the Soviet government were unsure on whether to keep it or tear it down. As the monument was extremely beloved and popular, they decided against demolishing it, and instead opted to change its meaning. The woman on top of it was from now on no longer to symbolize Latvia, but was now Mother Russia, while the 3 stars she was holding were no longer the 3 historical states, but the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which indeed was very subtle. As you can imagine, no one bought this brainwashing, and the vast majority of Latvians rejected the new symbolism. As such, throughout the end of the Soviet Union's life, The monument and subsequent square became a popular gathering area for protests against the ruling regime. Not far from the monument also lies the city's largest Orthodox church, the Riga Nativity Orthodox Church. The church is a glance into the past of Latvia under the Russian Empire, as it was built in the late 19th century under Tsar Alexander II. At the time of its construction, it claimed the title of largest Orthodox church in the Baltic, a name it still clings on to today. It was built in the beautiful Neo-Byzantine style and became renowned for its iconography. During World War I, when the Germans occupied the country, the church was converted to a Lutheran house of worship. But after the war was ceased, the decision was reversed. During Latvia's first independence period, the government gradually became increasingly anti-Russian and anti-Orthodox due to the centuries of occupation and Russian rule. As such, the church became under threat of being demolished, but was luckily saved by a native Latvian archbishop. Yet in the end, it wasn't the Latvians who made the church cease its services, but the Soviets. As in 1960, they closed its doors for religious services, remounted its bells donated by Alexander II, destroyed its crucifixes, and converted the building into a planetarium. Luckily, in the late 90s, the church was restored and put into service yet again. However, the restoration efforts are still in progress to reverse the damage inflicted upon it by the Soviet government. Going back to the old town, we head into Riga's most well-known and beloved Town Hall Square, where we can find a variety of stunning buildings such as the Town Hall itself. But none beat our next subject, the House of the Blackheads. Despite the building having an absolutely disgusting name when translated into English, it is an absolutely astonishing and breathtaking example of Baroque architecture in the entire country and possibly the entire world. Built in the 14th century and over the centuries constantly renovated and improved on, the House of the Blackheads was constructed to serve as a place for various high-end meetings, feasts, and social events of Riga's upper and merchant class. In the 17th century, the house's main residence became the German merchant guild that was known as the Brotherhood of Blackheads. Again, ew, and because of them, the building got such a terrible name. However, the name makes more sense considering that the merchants of Riga chose Saint Maurice as their patron saint. Maurice was a 3rd century Egyptian Roman legion commander who over history has been depicted as black because if you're from anywhere that's across the Bosphorus, your skin is the same as that of a permanent blackboard marker. He was killed by the emperor due to his Christian faith via decapitation, hence the name Blackhead. Unfortunately, during World War II, the building was completely and utterly destroyed due to the bombings of both the Germans and the Soviets, because of which it remained to be out of existence until the 90s, when the newly independent Latvian government began efforts of its restoration. For a couple of years, funds for its rebuilding were crowdfunded via donations, and the building was brought back in its full glory in 1999. Today, the house is yet again the home of many luxurious and prestigious events, such as concerts, gala dinners, parties, conferences, and all sorts of cultural events which you can visit if you ever make your way north to Latvia. Last but not least, we have yet another one of Riga's gems, the Riga Dome Cathedral. Arguably, this building is the religiously most significant and important in the entire city. The cathedral started construction all the way back in the beginning of the 13th century, not long after the founding of the city. Over the years, more and more of the cathedral will be built, and its shape and styles would change several times throughout history. Because of this, the building became an amalgamation of Romanesque, early Gothic, Baroque, and Art Nouveau. Unlike the other churches in the city that got destroyed by some sort of war or natural disaster, the Riga Dome Cathedral, for the most part, was left in one piece. Albeit, for a brief time under the Soviets, it was turned into a concert hall because the Soviet Union was essentially ready if it ever became a state. Today, however, the cathedral serves an important role as the seat of the Archbishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Latvia, and hell, is even one of the main concert venues in the city, because it's just chill like that. And yeah, that would be Latvia, a country rich with history that over the centuries has been in the sights of many much more powerful forces and empires who seek to take control of it for themselves. But despite all the hardship, the country and its people were able to prevail above all and come out stronger and more prosperous than ever. Like a girl with borderline personality disorder who wears her emotions on her sleeve, Latvia wears its architecture on its, showcasing its magnificent past and the centuries of change it went through. Hopefully, the future changes that keep coming Latvia's way will only continue to be positive and the nation and its people will continue to prosper. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. If you'd like to support me, smash the like and subscribe button, and if you really like this video, consider buying some of my merch at ironicshop.com. As always, thank you to all the wonderful people that support this channel, especially our members. We really couldn't do it without you. My name is Janos, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey